Daniel chapter 5. Now, we are at the final couple of chapters of Daniel. The first 6 chapters of Daniel really describe the man Daniel. They tell us who he was, tell us his story. He's really the star of the story. Actually, take that back. Daniel is not the star of the story. God is the star of the story, because this is all about God's working throughout the lives of the men, of the different situations. But we're looking at the man Daniel a lot during these first 6 chapters. And so we're going to wrap that up in the next couple of weeks after this week. Your questions for next week are chapter 6, the beginning of Daniel the Lion's Den. But I have you digging into some other verses, as I always do, that get you looking at some other things in the Bible that kind of go along with the themes. And then our last week of Daniel, chapter 6, we'll be looking at the Lion's Den, which is a story that everybody is familiar with, but we're going to look at it, obviously, through different eyes, since we're older and wiser from when we were little kids and heard that story. Anyway, but we're going to look at that, and then we will be sort of tying it up here for this first semester, and then second, after Christmas, we'll jump into chapter 7 to the end, which gets us into prophecy. And it's so the book of Daniel is divided up into 2 parts very clearly, and so that's what we're working on right now. But we also get to learn another interesting thing. As we're looking at the life of Daniel, we're also learning about the different kings that have been a part of what we call the Gentile rule. And so this is the beginning of the times of the Gentiles, when Nebuchadnezzar conquers Babylon and conquers Jerusalem and takes everybody into captivity in Babylon. That was the beginning of the times of the Gentiles. And so now it's the times of the Gentiles, means there's a line of kings that are going to come along. And so last week we actually met a new leader, a new king. He's not actually a king, he's kind of a co-king, co-regent with Nabonidus. So Nabonidus is actually the king of Babylon right now, followed way back from Nebuchadnezzar. So Nebuchadnezzar was the first king of Babylon. He was the one who took the Israelites into captivity. He's the one that took Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and brought them into his palace to be trained, to be leaders in his regime. And then after Nebuchadnezzar dies, then we have this whole crazy stuff that happens. His first son is evil Murdoch or Marduk or something like that. It's just a weird name, but his first name is evil. So, that already tells you something. Anyway, he's a bad king. He doesn't live very long. And then his son takes over. His son doesn't live very long. And then his brother-in-law, who is married to his sister, takes over. And Nabonidus is actually, most scholars believe, another brother-in-law. So, brother-in-law of King Nebuchadnezzar, which means that this young man, Belshazzar, who is the main player in this chapter, is his son, which makes him a grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. So, most likely, Belshazzar is his grandson. Now, we got into that a little bit last week. Belshazzar is having a huge party. It's not just a party though. This is a party of all parties. This is a huge spring break party. This is a huge fraternity house party, like that lasts for days and days and days. And all kinds of things are going on in this party. And most, if you go back and look at, I was reading some more history type stuff about the history of the Babylonians and Chaldean culture, and things that they did. They're horrible. There's pictures of, you can go back and find pictures of pornography. You can find pictures of all sorts of things that they did, along with words that talk about the types of things that they would do at these parties. So they're really types of orgies and horrible drinking parties. All of this is going on. Now, what's very interesting about this is who is missing. Daniel is not at this party, right? Daniel is not there, and so while all these people are partying, there is this, all of a sudden a hand begins to write on the wall. So if you didn't read this last week, you need to just go back and let's look at verse 5. So after they're partying, all kinds of things are going on, and one thing that they were doing that was so blasphemous was they were drinking out of some of the things that were taken out of the temple. So when Nebuchadnezzar conquered Babylon and he took the Israelites into captivity, he actually went into the temple of God and took out some of the holy vessels. Some of those things that were there that were probably around the Ark of the Covenant and all those sorts of things that were in the temple. You go back and read in 1 Kings about what the temple looked like and the type of things that were in the temple that God gave direction to Solomon to build. And you will see those types of vessels that were described that were part of the temple. Well, he stole some of those, brought them back into Babylon, and that was all to show his power over the gods of the Israelites. Now, at that time, Nebuchadnezzar did not know the God of the Israelites at all, but he gets to know him, as we found out throughout this whole story. We'll talk about that in just a minute. So those vessels were brought into Babylon. They have been sitting there probably on display, kind of like a trophy case. Look what we have. But this night, or this big ceremony, this big party that Belshazzar has, he decides, hey, you know what? I'm going to show everybody that we're okay. Because meanwhile, while they're partying, outside we have the approach of the Medes and the Persians. And they are coming slowly in. I can just kind of picture it. I'm a big Lord of the Rings kind of fan, and some of those movies where, you know, they're moving in, and somebody's inside the castle or inside the walls, and there is this huge group of people moving to take over. That's what's going on. So they're having this party. They think everything's good, but the Medes and the Persians are on their way. It is not long before D-Day has come for Belshazzar and really the whole Babylonian rule here. But so anyway, the Medes and the Persians are on their way. They've been conquering all along. They probably have already conquered a lot of other places, maybe even conquered Nabonidus at this point. But they're outside the walls. And so he's probably trying to show all of his people, we got this. We don't need to worry about it. Look at us. We're drinking out of the vessels from all these other gods. We're more powerful than all of them. So he's blasphemous, he's proud, he's arrogant, he's boastful. He is really just a vile person, and he is making fun of, in a lot of ways, and mocking the God. He's mocking God. And so, God is not going to let him get away with this. So when we pick up here in verse 5, it says, at that moment, the fingers of a man's hand appeared and began writing on the plaster of the king's palace wall next to the lampstand. As the king watched the hand that was writing, his face turned pale, and his thoughts so terrified him that he soiled himself, and his knees knocked together. The king shouted to bring in the mediums, Chaldeans, and diviners. He said to these wise men of Babylon, whoever reads this inscription and gives me its interpretation will be clothed in purple, have a gold chain around his neck, and have the third highest position in the kingdom. So all the king's wise men came in, but none could read the inscription or make his interpretation known to him. And then King Belshazzar became even more terrified. His face turned pale, and his nobles were bewildered. Now, we talked a little bit about this last week, but it really is so comical. The way he was so scared. Now, I guess we would be scared too. We're standing here, everything's cool, and all of a sudden there's a hand that starts writing on the wall up there. We would probably all be a little scared too. We would probably go, what is going on? But I think if you're inebriated, you probably are even more wondering what's going on. And so he is freaking out here. His knees are knocking together and wets his pants. And, you know, that's where the idea came. I'm so scared I'm going to, you know, whatever. You know, got my point. This is on video, so I don't want to say that. But anyway, but it's really interesting how the writer, Daniel, is so detailed about this, how scared he was, his knees knocking together. And then he was pale. Now his mediums, all of his diviners, his magicians, all of them come in to try to give him answers, and they can't, right? Because they don't know anything. They make things up. They are literally just yes men. And they come in and tell him what he wants to hear. That's what all of these guys did. They had no power because they were not worshiping the true God. They were only trying to figure out, it was all in their own mind, and so they literally did not know what they were talking about. So they couldn't answer anything. They didn't know what was on the writing on the wall was all about. They were probably scared too. He also said, if anybody can do this, I will make them third in the kingdom. Now that's an important little statement there, because what that meant was that explains this whole thing. Nabonidus is number 1, Belshazzar is 2, this person would be number 3. So that's how we know that Belshazzar is not the king, but he's in, so it's going to be the person that can tell them what the writing on the wall means would be like in the triumvirate, would be one of the trifecta, and they would be able to lead together. So that's what they were told. So they all wanted that, of course, but they had no answers for him. So all of this happens. He's turning pale, doesn't know what to do. And then in verse 10, because of the outcry of the king and his nobles, now I think that's interesting too, little fact there. So he's screaming. He's going crazy and berserk, and she's probably coming to go, what are y'all doing? What in the world is all this noise about? You know, the queen is just like, this is ridiculous. Because she hears him screaming and carrying on, because the outcry was so loud. The fear that he felt and the way he was acting. So she comes in there, and she walks in there and she says, came to the banquet, may the king live forever. She said, don't let your thoughts terrify you or your face be pale. There is a man in your kingdom who has a spirit of the holy gods in him. In the days of your predecessor, he was found to have insight, intelligence, and wisdom like the wisdom of the gods. Your predecessor, King Nebuchadnezzar, appointed him chief of the magicians, mediums, Chaldeans, and diviners. Your own predecessor, the king, did this because Daniel, the one that the king named Belshazzar, was found to have an extraordinary spirit, knowledge and intelligence, and the ability to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve problems. Therefore, summon Daniel, and he will give the interpretation. So, the queen comes in. Now, we don't know who she is. She's not Belshazzar's wife. She's probably the queen mother of some form or fashion. So she could be the mother. There's a lot of different possibilities of who she could be. She could be the wife of Nebuchadnezzar. She could actually be the elderly surviving wife of Nebuchadnezzar, because he's been dead for about 20 years. So it's possible that she's just an older woman who is his wife. So we don't really know for sure. But the way it kind of is described here, you think it maybe it's somebody that's not, that wasn't his wife. But she could be the wife of Nabonidus. But she was old enough to have knowledge of the prophet Daniel and wise enough as well. So she was like, okay, you need to call on this guy. The rest of these guys don't know anything. And this is the guy that knows something. He's got the knowledge, the spirit of the holy gods. She recognized that he had the spirit of the holy gods. Now, she doesn't understand that there is only one God, but she sees something different in Daniel. Now, as we go along tonight, this is what I want to do. I'm just going to walk you through these scriptures because there's so many cool things to talk about. And I just want to point out key truths as we go along. So the first thing here that is so true is that she sees something different in Daniel. This is, and this is not the first time. So if you've been studying with us all along, with chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, every single time somebody comes upon Daniel, it is talked about the fact that he is different. He is not like everybody else. Let's remember, he's not at the party. He's not been at the party because he always removes himself from that kind of stuff. That is not who he is. He's not in the middle of that. He's not hanging out with all the magicians and all of those people. He is away from that. And I, as I was thinking about this, I was just thinking, this is, this group of people that he is living among are all pagans. They are not believers. They are not Jews. They don't have the same belief system as him. And Nebuchadnezzar, who maybe had become a believer that we kind of talked about in chapter 4, he's been gone for about 20 years. And what we believe is that Daniel has been demoted. He's no longer probably a leader at this time because he wasn't in with the group. But he still is known by his reputation. And I think it's a real important truth for us to keep in mind is wherever we are working, wherever we're living, whatever space that we're in, where we're around people who are not believers. We're around people who are maybe they believed at one time, but they're not anymore. Whatever the case, we need to be different. We need to be set apart. We don't need to look like everybody else. We don't have to be the middle of the party, but look what happens. He still gets brought in. He gets called upon because he has something different about him. And that is one of the things that I remember, and I try to talk to young people about this all the time when they go off to college, because I'm like, you're going to college, and I know it's going to be, you're going to be tempted, and you're going to be around all sorts of people that maybe don't believe like you. You can still be respected and liked and not have to join in. You can still have a relationship with these people, but still be different. Stand for what you believe in. And we've seen Daniel do this all the way along, and he still continues to do that. He's not in the middle of anything. In any of these cases, he's never in with the group. And I think we just have to think about that. I think he doesn't join in, and I think another thing about that, so one thing is to be, you're around people that are not believers and you act different, you behave differently because you want to make a difference. But another thing is that he doesn't join in on their stuff. So let's just think about it. Just everybody think about it. A lot of us have worked in environments where we're working around people who are, and maybe sometimes they're believers, but people start gossiping. We could, and it's much easier to just go along with it and just to talk about the boss or talk about, the other teachers, or look at her, what does she do, blah, 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 or can you believe them? And we get sucked into it because that is, for women, a very difficult thing. We do have a little issue, I think, sometimes in struggling with the whole area of gossip, and that is one of the things that Paul talks about in the New Testament. But it doesn't matter, girl or guy. It's very easy to get pulled into those things. But as believers, we really should be set apart. We should be that person that the person's like, well, you notice how she never talks about anybody? It doesn't mean they're not going to like you, but you don't have to join in on all of that. You don't have to join in on jokes that are not appropriate or other types of things, and you can still be respected. Daniel, in every single case, turns out to be respected by these pagan people who are partying and involved in all kinds of stuff. He still has really he has much more integrity than the rest of them do, obviously, as we know about that. And so I think that is just one part of this that's kind of an interesting little side note. But she says, bring him in. These are all the things about him. She talks about the fact that he has understanding, that he can interpret dreams, but that he can explain riddles and solve difficult problems. I think that's really interesting kind of wording there. He can do a lot of things. He's lifted up for things that are not like magic, but they're things that all of us have the ability to do because we have God in us. And so there are times when, and I think, I remember a situation in college where I had a girl that was in a class with me, and we went down, we were in totally different groups. I was really involved in the BSU, which was the Baptist Student Union, and she was really involved in sororities and was a little sister in a fraternity and all that. We were just very, very different. But we sat beside each other in class, and I just really, I just determined I was going to be her friend. She was just, of course I wasn't going to not be her friend, but I knew we wouldn't probably hang out together. Well, what happened was every single weekend, every single Monday when we come to class, I would talk about my weekend. But I would talk about things like going to church and about going to a Christian concert with my boyfriend. I was dating him. And I would talk to her about all the things that we did. And it was always just and I was always like, yeah, we just had a great time. We went and saw this and did that and blah, blah, blah. And one day she goes, so you talk about God like it's just like normal, like it's just a part of your life. And I was like, well, it is. This is the most important thing in my life, so it's just going to kind of come out in conversation. And she's like, that's really, really weird. I've never, I don't know if she used the word weird, but she's very unusual. I've never seen that before. But she was still my friend. She didn't want to not be my friend. She would still talk to me. And I'll never forget the day that Avery came to my room in a dorm. It was just maybe a few months after we met each other, and she came running in and she says, I want you to tell me about Jesus. I want you to tell me about being a Christian. And she came from a different denomination, not that it was a non-Christian denomination, but she definitely had not grown up hearing about Christ. And it's probably one of the most exciting things that happened to me in college. She accepted Christ. She started going to BSU with me. She broke up with this boyfriend that was really a toxic relationship, and it was really cool to see her begin to grow. She started going to a Bible study, and everything in her life changed. But it was like the biggest thing for me was an aha moment. I don't have to not be myself. I was just myself. I treated her as if she was just like one of my Christian friends. but she wasn't. She was talking to all her other friends about the party that weekend, but with me, we were talking about this, and I just realized that sometimes we try too hard to fit in with other people, afraid that they aren't going to like us, but really and truly, if we will just stand up for Jesus, if we'll just be the people that God has created us and be authentic in our relationship with the Lord, like talking about what He's taught us or answered prayer, and just being willing. I'm not saying you're preaching all day long or quoting Bible scriptures to everybody all the time, but you're living out your faith in an authentic way. People are going to see you, and you are going to be different, and you're going to be the one that they call when they need help. You're going to be the one that they're going to say, I really need some advice, and I know that you go to church. Sometimes people will just say, I know you go to church, or I know that you know the Bible. I just have some questions. I just need you to pray for me, and they'll come to you. You know what? Maybe they won't invite you to their parties because you don't really want to go anyway. And if you did, then you're missing the whole picture here. But even if you don't get invited to the parties, they're gonna call you. And that's what you want to keep in mind, is that the way we behave in front of the pagan world, unbelievers, and even for those people who are believers but have fallen away from God. A lot of times they've fallen away from the church and have fallen away from God because of believers who are not authentic, who were gossipers and acted just like everybody else, and backbiting and ugly and unkind. And so they don't want to have anything to do with it. So that's why we need to be different. We need to be like Daniel, because he stood out. So the queen knew it, and then we get to this next part. So let's jump in real quick to verse 13. So Daniel was brought before the king. The king asked him, Are you Daniel, one of the exiles brought from Judah by my predecessor, King Nebuchadnezzar? So, I think it's kind of funny that he asked that, because, she said, go get Daniel. He came in there, and then he asked him if that's who he was. So it's just kind of a weird statement there. And he says, I have heard that the spirit of the gods within you, the spirit of the gods are within you, and that you are filled with insight, understanding, and wisdom. This is verse 14 that we're on. I don't know if you've lost this or not, but I've heard that you have a spirit of the gods in you, that your insight, intelligence, and extraordinary wisdom is found in you. Those are two different versions here. Okay, so this is the deal. This is very, very interesting. He knew who Daniel was. Now, he didn't maybe remember him that much, because maybe he was a child when Daniel was, but he had heard of Daniel. Because here, even though the queen brings it to his mind, that it's clear that he knew. He says, I have heard that you have the spirit of the gods within you. And I know, he says, you are the one that my predecessor, Nebuchadnezzar, my ancestor, my father, he calls him in some versions, which we know that's because he's probably his grandfather, had talked about him. I think that Belshazzar understood that there was a different spirit in Daniel, that there was something different, something about a God. We don't know if he actually heard about Nebuchadnezzar. We don't know if he heard that story, because it could be possible that he heard the story about his grandfather, that this whole experience that happened with him, but Daniel's about to tell him about it anyway. But what is interesting here is that Belshazzar, and we find this out in just a minute, I'll talk more about this in a minute, but he really doesn't have any excuse, because he knows about the God that the prophet Daniel comes to talk about. So, let's get to this next verse. I'm going to flip on to verse 15, and I numbered my pages tonight, so I would with the printer. So I'm trying to keep up with it a little bit better. Page 15. My wise men and enchanters have tried to read the words on the wall and tell me their meaning, but they cannot do it. Verse 16. I am told that you can give interpretations and solve difficult problems. If you can read these words and tell me their meaning, you will be clothed in purple robes of royal honor, and you will have a gold chain placed around your neck. You will become the third highest ruler in the kingdom. So he says, so Belshazzar had heard about Daniel, but what we think is that he's basically been ignored for the past 22 years. Daniel has not been brought out of hiding. Wherever he's been, which next week we'll find out what Daniel does on a regular basis, and we'll talk about that next week. But Daniel's been not been called upon for 22 years while since Nebuchadnezzar is gone. And so, and he's basically, he's saying that if you will tell us, we will give you this third position in the ruler. And I love Daniel's answer. Daniel answered the king, keep your gifts or give them to someone else. I don't want your stuff. I don't want to join you in ruling. Now remember, he was a ruler in the other regime with Nebuchadnezzar, but he doesn't want to have anything to do with ruling with Belshazzar. And it's probably because he knows definitely that Belshazzar is not the same breed as Nebuchadnezzar, even though they're both pagan kings and did a lot of evil things. There's something different about Belshazzar. It doesn't have the same openness maybe that Nebuchadnezzar had. But he says, keep your gifts, give them to someone else, but I will tell you what the writing means. Now, Daniel's sermon was short that he's about to tell him, but it's not sweet. It's not short and sweet, it's just short. But it's very penetrating. And I want you to notice how he behaves so differently. Remember when Nebuchadnezzar asked him to tell him about a dream, and he was very nervous to talk to Nebuchadnezzar. He didn't want to talk to him about it. He didn't want to tell him what the dream actually meant, that you're about to go out and be having to go into the wilderness and all this kind of stuff, and God is going to humble you. He didn't want to tell him that. He was nervous. He has no problem talking to Belshazzar and telling him about what's about to happen to him. And like I said, Daniel's not interested in any of his gifts. He really doesn't care. He's just going to be forthright and bold about what he's about to tell him. And so what happens here right after verse 17 is we have Daniel, and I think this is a really powerful point here, that Daniel wasn't afraid of the king. It's very, very obvious that he's not got any fear of this king. Now, this is a king that probably has been known to do terrible things. I mean, he's been partying all this time. Now, this is really important for us to keep in mind. He's not got any fear. Why? Why is Daniel not afraid of Belshazzar? And he never was even afraid of Nebuchadnezzar either, but here, he's not afraid at all to just be very forthright and to talk to him. And I think it's because of his deep, abiding walk with God. Because, see, this is the deal. When you have a deep, abiding walk with God, you aren't afraid of men, of any men. You aren't afraid. You live with a sense of confidence and assurance that is different. So you can go and you can speak truth to somebody without being afraid of what they're going to do or how they're going to. His head could have been chopped off. He could have been killed immediately. That could have been the end of his life. You're hanged to speak out this truth to this Belshazzar. But he wasn't afraid. He's like, I don't want your stuff, but I'll tell you what it says. And there's no fear there. And I think that's because of that. He wasn't, and I think this is the other thing. This is so, and I know I'm reading into this just slightly, but that's okay. This is a little bit of what I think the Lord has shown me, and that is, he's been in Babylon now for almost 70 years. This is important. This is the very end of his time that he's been in Babylon. He's been there for 70 years. He doesn't question why he's there anymore. God has shown him over and over again that he placed him there and he has used him. He's been in positions of power to such a degree, and we don't even have the whole story. He doesn't ask those questions. He knows why he's there. That's what gives him confidence. When we know that we're in the will of God, it doesn't matter if we're in Babylon or in Newman. It doesn't matter if we're working for a Christian company or a heathen company. If we know that we're in the will of God, then we can be confident. And we can walk in peace and assurance in that. And isn't that the kind of life you want to live? A life that isn't afraid of men because you know you're in the will of God. A life that is comfortable and confident in wherever the Lord has placed you, whatever job you're in, whatever neighborhood you're in, whatever marriage you're in or not marriage you're in, right? Single or married, you are confident that you are where you're supposed to be. When you have a deep abiding walk with God, you live in this confidence. And so then you don't fight with, why am I in Babylon? Why is God allowing this? You live in this, I'm okay with this because I know that God has me here for a reason. I've seen it and I'm trusting him. And that's even when all the other things around you just don't even make sense. And so Anyway, so let's look at verse 18 because this is where he begins to tell about the prophecy. Your Majesty, the Most High God gave your Majesty, the Most High God gave sovereignty, majesty, glory, and honor to your predecessor Nebuchadnezzar. Now that's the New Living Translation. Let me read that same verse in this Holman Standard Version. Your Majesty, the Most High God gave sovereignty, greatness, glory, and majesty to your predecessor Nebuchadnezzar. Some versions may say bestowed. Does anybody have bestowed on in your word choice there? Bestowed upon him. I think that could be the King James Version. Probably nobody has that in here. But anyway, he says that he bestowed it, gave it to him. So the Most High God, he's giving credit. Well, it's not in King James either. Okay, then maybe, yeah, okay, whatever. Maybe it's in another place in this verse. But your Majesty, the Most High God, gave sovereignty. So, majesty, glory, and honor to your predecessor Nebuchadnezzar. Now, this is important because really what he means is that God is the one who gave it to him. How many times have we heard this? This is at least the 6th time in the book of Daniel that we've heard it say, God gave him. God gave him the power. God gave him the ability. God allowed him to take the Israelites captive. So over and over again, he's telling them, this is, like I said, this is a huge history lesson he's giving him. He made him great, so great that people of all races and nations and languages trembled before him in fear. So in 2 verses, Daniel is saying to Belshazzar, the Most High God, one singular God. Remember, this is a pagan man who is an idolatrous. He worships many gods, worships himself, worships, human flesh. I mean, he was just a very godless man, but if he worshipped anything, it was gods. It was idols, okay? And now he's saying the Most High God, which he's talking about Jehovah God, he's the one that gave the sovereignty. He allowed Nebuchadnezzar to rule. He is also the one that made him great, so that all the people of the world would bow down to him. And then he says he killed those he wanted to kill, and he spared those he wanted to spare. We're still talking about God. God did all these things. He honored those he wanted to honor, and he disgraced those he wanted to disgrace. Again, talking about Jehovah God. But when his heart and mind were puffed up with arrogance, and then he talks about, actually, you know what? Let me look at it in this version, because that New Living Translation kind of gets off in here. So it says, verse 18, 19, because of the greatness he gave him, all peoples and nations. So some of those things were about what Nebuchadnezzar did because God gave him the power. So make sure I clarify that, because in the New Living Translation it kind of sounds a little confusing there. Back to it says, because of the greatness he gave him, God gave him, all peoples, nations, and languages were terrified and fearful of him. And that's talking about Nebuchadnezzar. He killed anyone he wanted and kept alive anybody he wanted. He exalted anyone he wanted, and he humbled anyone he wanted. And he's talking about Nebuchadnezzar, but making claim that God is the one that allowed him to do that, allowed him to do all those things. Then he gets to verse 20. But when his heart, talking about Nebuchadnezzar, was exalted and his spirit became arrogant, so pride and arrogance, we talked about that was a problem that Nebuchadnezzar had in chapter 4, and really from the very beginning. He was deposed from his royal throne, and his glory was taken from him. He was driven away from people. His mind was like an animal's. He lived with the wild donkeys. He was fed grass like cattle, and his body was drenched with dew from the sky until he acknowledged that the Most High God is ruler over human kingdoms and sets anyone he wants over them. So he reads this whole, he gives this whole explanation to him before he tells them about the writing on the wall. He's telling him about the sovereignty of God. And that is part of this history lesson. Please be clear, he's saying to him basically. I want you to know that Nebuchadnezzar ruled, but he ruled because of the Most High God. He is the one that gave him all this power. So he's given him this huge lesson on the sovereignty of God and talks through this history. Now, by the way, on a little side note, if you go back to chapter 4 and read this story again about when Nebuchadnezzar is humbled and has to go live with the wild animals, it never mentions donkeys. So this is a new fact for us here. He lived with the donkeys. So just in case you didn't know that, he lived with the donkeys, and the wild cattle were around him. Now, So it gives him this lesson on that, and he is really emphasizing God's sovereignty over men and nations. That's the whole point of all that he talks about there. Even over the most powerful man on earth, God was more powerful. Now this is really important, guys, because he's setting Belshazzar up for what's about to happen. He's telling him, he's giving all praise to God, the Most High God. He's the one that gets all the praise, really. And, you know, Paul in the New Testament echoes the same sentiment when he is talking. He talks about in Romans chapter 13, verse 1, it says, every person is to be in subjection to the governing authorities. Talking about people that are in government. For there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. We've talked about this, and we can't stress it enough. Every person who is serving in government or any of those things ultimately does not have any power but what God has given them. So them being in those places, whether they're heathen or not, whether they're, you know, we sometimes wonder, well, which candidate is a Christian and which is not. I mean, a lot of times none of them are Christians. And we see that from history. This is just because, so we can't necessarily pick somebody because they're a Christian. They may claim to be a Christian because that is expedient, right? When you're in a race and you're trying to get the Christians on your side. So we don't know a person's heart and whether they're a believer or not, but the bottom line is it doesn't matter. Whoever God wants to have on the throne, whoever God allows there, is who's going to be there. And that's what we have to keep in mind, and that's something we cannot lose sight of. If you don't learn anything else from Daniel, this is something you got to grasp. This is something we have to understand. As frustrated as we get with our government, at the end of the day, the government we have is somewhat the government God is allowing. Now, does it mean it has to be a good government just because God is put him there? No. Oftentimes they're not good, but God is allowing it. And that's why we trust God in the midst of it. We may be a Daniel in Babylon, but it's okay. God is, if we're faithful to God, well, he remains faithful even if we're not faithful to him, right? So he's faithful even when we are in Babylon. So we can't, even though we do have a pagan ruler, no matter what. So anyway, I think sometimes, and I'm like, this is for me. This is for me as much as anybody. I'm super political sometimes, and I can get very wrapped up in it. I'm very frustrated with what's going on in the government. I have to turn it off and not talk about it or not read it or listen to it because it frustrates me. But then I read this and I'm like, okay, Val, look, this is not about who is in charge because God is in charge. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. God is the one who makes the calls at the end. And so, anyway, all that being said, he gives this lesson to Belshazzar. God is sovereign. He's in control. Then, so Paul says, God places people, he establishes rulers. Hannah, do y'all remember the story of Hannah in 1 Samuel 2:4-9? Hannah prayed for a son. She could not have children, and so she prayed for a son, and God gave her a son. She promised to give that son back to God, and he went back and served, and Samuel was her son that she had after. And she puts him back into the service of God, takes him to the temple and leaves him there, and he grows up to be a great priest for God and one of God's great leaders during that time period. She speaks about God's sovereignty. I just want to read a couple lines from this. This is from 1 Samuel 2:4-9, if you want to read it sometime. The bows of the mighty are shattered, but the feeble gird on strength. Those who were full hire themselves out for bread, but those who were hungry cease to hunger. Even the barren gives birth to 7, but she who has many children languishes. The Lord kills and makes alive. He brings down Sheol and raises up. The Lord makes poor and rich. He brings low. He also exalts. He raises the poor from the dust. He lifts up the needy from the ash heap to make them sit with nobles and inherit a seat of honor. For the pillars of the earth are the Lord's, and he set the world on them. He keeps the feet of his godly ones, but the wicked ones are silenced in darkness. And so she just gives praise to God's sovereignty. He's the one. He sets the whole world on the pillars that he establishes. Moses writes in Deuteronomy 32:39, "See now that I am he, and there is no God besides me. It is I who put to death and give life. I have wounded, and it is I who heal. And there is no one who can deliver from my hand." That was from Deuteronomy 32:39. Job says in Job 5:18, for he inflicts pain and he gives relief. He wounds and his hands also heal. Talking about God. And then Psalm 68:20, God is to us a God of deliverances, and to God the Lord belong, escapes from death. That seems like I left something. Oh, not a minute. I look like I left off a verse there. Okay. Or left off part of that. And then Jesus declares, do not be afraid. This is in Revelations chapter 1. Do not be afraid. I am the first and the last and the living one. And I was dead, and behold, I am alive forever, and I have the keys of death and of Hades. Now, we could just go on and on and on. The Bible is filled with verses about the sovereignty of God. God in control. God's plans. And I've brought it up. I know for some of you are probably like, doesn't she talk about sovereignty a lot? Yeah, because that's the theme of this book. It really is the theme of Daniel. It is all about the sovereignty of God, how God is in control. And he was orchestrating and allowing Daniel to be here. And that's why he used him while he was there, but that's why we can learn and be encouraged by Daniel, because we don't even live in anything like that. I mean, our world might feel frustrating and lots of things about it, but it's nothing like Babylon quite yet. But we're headed in that direction. But we are not exactly like Babylon, so we should not be, afraid. But anyway, let me get to this. I want to wrap it up with some of these last things here that are really interesting. So, he says to him at the end of that little thing that he just read all about and how God does all these things, look at verse 22. You are his successor. So he tells about all the things that happened to Nebuchadnezzar. He tells that story again, and the truth is, Belshazzar probably maybe knew a little bit about that, maybe not. His arrogance may have ignored it and been one of those teenagers that didn't listen, when they were trying to tell him about all this. But anyway, you're his successor of Belshazzar, and you knew all of this, yet you have not humbled yourself. Now, this is where he's really calling him out. You knew all this. You knew that God would humble. You knew that God was in charge. So he is actually calling him out and saying, you did know this. You knew about Nebuchadnezzar. You knew that he was brought down and that he was arrogant and he tried to raise up above God and God humbled him. You knew that. And yet you knew all this, yet you have not humbled yourself. And that word, yet you, is real important there. Because you knew it, and it's a huge contrast because Nebuchadnezzar does. If you did not get to read chapter 4 of Daniel, please read that. Read the ending, because we believe chapter 4 is Nebuchadnezzar's testimony of how he came to faith in God. He repented. He came to his senses. He was living with that, and all of a sudden he realized, I am not all that great. There is a God that's greater than me. And he humbled, and he prayed, and he repented of, and so we don't know the full scope of all that happened with Nebuchadnezzar, but it's clear something major happened. There was a change, but there is no change with Belshazzar. At least that's what we see here. So it's a huge contrast between what happened to Nebuchadnezzar and what happens here to Belshazzar. And so in a lot of ways, Belshazzar is playing out that whole phrase that says, for those who, you've heard the saying before, that says, those who forget history are doomed to repeat it. That's what happened. He forgot what he knew, and now he's repeating it, living in arrogance before the Most High God. Not humbled your heart, he says to him, and that is a huge deal. Now, I want to take a minute to talk about something really interesting about this point, and it sort of was brought up in a verse ahead, but I want to just make a point about it. Belshazzar knew something. Okay, this is what we know. Belshazzar may not have known everything, but he knew something because Nebuchadnezzar or Daniel would not have said that. This is a very good little picture of, a lot of times, and I know a lot of you have gone down this road where you've gone like, what about those who have never heard? What about people who don't know about God? And This is a great picture because what happens is we're going to find out Belshazzar is judged by God and he's found wanting. That's how we're going to end it up. But, so he is judged by God, but he knew, because he knew. What this verse is telling us, he knew enough. And he knew enough, even if he didn't know everything, he knew enough to humble himself and he chose not to. He was judged by God fairly. So let me put that together in this puzzle. People that live in these countries where you think, well, that is not fair. What this tells us is we are all without excuse. We all have a certain amount of knowledge or light that we have a choice to accept and believe. And Romans talks about this. In Romans chapter 1, it says that all men are without excuse because God has made himself known. This is showing us how Belshazzar had a moment where he knew enough about this God. He had heard. And he's being called out by Daniel. You knew, and yet you did not change. And so this is where we can kind of see another picture. And there's other places this as well, but I think, I know I've come across a lot of people that struggle with this. Like, I don't understand. What about those who've never heard? And you hear the gospel at a church service and get a chance to accept Christ at the end of a sermon. It may look completely different. Whatever it is, though, we're all responsible for what we do know. So he knew something, and he chose not to do it. So hopefully that makes sense to you, and I'll talk more about it later if you want to ask questions about that, because I think it's an interesting thing. But when a person knows, has heard about God, think about Nebuchadnezzar, heard about it over and over again. First in first chapter of Daniel, then in the second chapter, in the third chapter, and it took to the fourth chapter, and lots of years of watching God work in Daniel's life and work in these miracles before he ever truly repented and came to Christ. But he had been hearing about it and seeing it, and then he finally got to that point. So it takes time sometimes for a person, but everybody will have a moment, and that's what we see here with Belshazzar. You knew, yet you knew, and you just didn't. You did not choose. You did not decide that you wanted to follow this God. So when a person knows, repeatedly refuses to believe, at some point, that's where the judgment will come. So, verse 23, you have proudly defied the Lord of heaven and have had these cups from this temple brought before you. So then he calls them out for specifically what he did. You and your nobles and your wives and concubines have been drinking wine from them while praising gods of silver, gold, bronze, iron, wood, and stone, gods that neither see nor hear nor know anything at all. Like, I would really like to have heard that sermon. Like, you were drinking and praising gods that are not even here. Are you a lunatic? I mean, it's just like, you are praising. There's like, if you were talking to somebody today who says, yeah, there's some people do worship the god of gold, right? Money. And, but they're worshiping inanimate objects. They're worshiping things that know nothing and can do nothing for them, which is the way a lot of people live their lives. They may not say they worship these things, but they put all their faith in themselves, what they can learn, what they can figure out, and how they live their lives, and they don't need God. They don't know anything. They're just basing it on their own human understanding, which is always going to come up short. And he says that they can neither hear anything or know anything at all, that you have not honored the God who gives you the breath of life and controls your destiny. So God has sent this hand to write this message. So there's 3 charges against Belshazzar. He had not humbled his heart. Well, there was 3 charges against Nebuchadnezzar. Let me tell you these. He had not humbled his heart before God. He deliberately mocked God by bringing in the holy vessels, and he worshipped idols. And that's the same thing that Belshazzar did, but Nebuchadnezzar decided to repent from those things, from that arrogance. And Belshazzar now, and ultimately pride, right? So pride, we talked about this with Nebuchadnezzar, it's the same thing here. He praised the gods of gold and silver, and that don't hear and understand, and I almost feel like it's sarcastic, a little bit. Daniel's attitude towards him is like, are you kidding? They don't even hear you. Are you insane? I mean, why would you praise them? The God who gave you breath, you're ignoring him? Most High God, you've heard about him. You know he's he's done great things. You've heard the miracles. You know about the three that weren't burned. I feel like the stories were out there. They weren't burned. They were, so he knows, and he chose not to believe, not to listen, not to bow. So this is what the message is. So in verse 24, we'll wrap it up here, I promise. He sent this hand to write this message. Verse 25. This is the writing that was inscribed. Mene, tekel, and parsin. This is the interpretation of the message. Mene means that God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel means that you have been weighed on the balance and found deficient. Peres, or parsin or Paris, means that your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. So, Daniel gives this thing. Now, this was written in Aramaic. This inscription was in Aramaic. This was the language of the Chaldeans. But what's interesting is it wasn't in a foreign language, but he didn't understand it. It was actually in his language, but he did not understand it. And so what happened was it just looked like a bunch of numbers on the wall. So basically they were words that they knew, but he doesn't understand them. It was like looking at a bunch of monetary values that were written on the wall. He didn't know what they meant. So mene is the mina, is 50 shekels. So that's what mene is. Tekel is the shekel, and a parsin is the half shekel, totaling 101.5 shekels. So that's what the numbers that were on the wall that was writing. So, I talked about last week the whole number on the wall thing and the writings on the wall and all that. A lot of these phrases that we've heard before come from this little chapter here. The mene means numbered. So the days of your kingdom were numbered. Your reign is about to be brought to an end. And mene is an Aramaic number that means weight, and it actually appears it's also in Pharaoh's dream in Genesis chapter 41. God has numbered your kingdom, basically. So he basically is about to be over. The days of your kingdom are over. And then he puts an end, just going to put an end to it. One commentator said the jig was up, and there's basically your number is up. That's what he's saying. Your number's up. You didn't bow when you could have. You knew this. So this is the thing we don't know. This is another part of that whole thing about people are responsible for the light. We don't have the whole story, right? We have parts of the story. We have the important part that God wanted us to know. But what we have to know is what was happening behind the scenes, what Belshazzar already knew, all the different conversations that he had through his life for the past 22 years. Maybe people have been telling him about Daniel. He's heard the stories. He's known about his grandfather, Nebuchadnezzar. These are things that I'm almost positive that he had heard and seen and known a little bit about, or Daniel wouldn't have said, you knew, yet you didn't. So the time has come. God is a just God. He gave him a chance. It wasn't just a one-time thing. It wasn't just one night where you had this terrible wild party and God said, that's it, you're dead. No, this was a process of him ignoring God and ignoring signs, ignoring opportunities to give the Most High God praise. Even if he didn't bow to him, but to desecrate his temple, those holy ornaments, and to blaspheme him that way, that was so. Tekel means that you've been weighed in the balances. So this is the concept of weighed in the balances. Now, back in ancient Egypt, we see pictures. We can actually see that they would basically, the concept was weighing out, so that the Egyptian Book of the Dead pictured men being weighed in balances after death to determine whether their sins or their bad things outweigh their good things. You ever heard of that? That's the way a lot of people live their lives. Well, I'm a pretty good person. I've done a lot of good things, so I think that's going to outweigh those bad things that I've done. A lot of people live their life that way, weighing the balances. But there will be a time when God will weigh our lives in the balance and say, you've been weighed on the balances and have not measured up. And so that's what happens there in verse 27. And then Parsin divided your kingdom, is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. So if you go back to chapter 2, God prophesied through the dream, or Daniel described the dream, that the next kingdom would be the Medes and the Persians, or would be a kingdom that would be not as powerful, but maybe bigger. So it's Babylonian. The Babylons were the most powerful, but the Medes and Persians are actually going to be a wider, bigger kingdom, just not as powerful as the Babylonian kingdom was. So it's going to be divided right here between the Medes and the Persians. And then that's verse 28. And then we get to verse 29. Then at Belshazzar's command, Daniel was dressed in purple robes, a gold chain was hung around his neck. He was proclaimed the third highest ruler in the kingdom. The problem is it didn't last very long. Because that very night, Belshazzar, the Babylonian king, was killed. So his whole thing was his days were numbered, and they were not just numbered, it was about to be over. So God gave him a final moment. Let's think about it. Could he have repented at that moment? Yes, he could have. But he didn't. We don't know why, or we didn't get any more of the story, but we just assume that he continued in his arrogant pride and is listening to Daniel, but he's not taking it in. He's hearing this truth being preached to him, but he chooses not to repent, because when Nebuchadnezzar did, God gave him back the kingdom. But Belshazzar does not do this, and that very night is gone. So it's almost like he was warned by God, then he was found guilty, and he was sentenced to his death right there. So Darius the Mede, in verse 31, took over the kingdom at the age of 62. And by the way, I call him Darius. That's a Southern version. I heard it another way. It was Darius. I don't know how you actually pronounce it. I'm going to stick with Darius. It sounds more, fits more my personality and my just the way I talk. So anyway, so his life was brought to an end this night, and we'll talk more about Darius next week, because he's in next week's study. But at this moment, this is the end of the Babylonian rule. All because it ends with Belshazzar, and it all ends because of pride. Now, if we would wrap this whole thing up, if you go back and look at this, and I bet you could do this, you could sit down and you could say, so this is what causes the fall of an empire. If you look at what's happened through the whole story, from verses chapter 1 through chapter 5, you can see how Babylon fell. And we can go back to all the ancient civilizations, and we can see how those ancient civilizations fell. They would all fall into very similar categories. When they became obsessed with worshiping the creation and not the creator, worshiping idols, becoming very focused on their own desires, becoming very immoral, falling into moral decline, not listening to truth, living for themselves without any parameters. All of those things would leads to the fall of an empire, and that's what we see here at the end with Belshazzar coming to the end. So I think, the last thing I just think that I can kind of end this with, and it's really a great reminder. We've talked about it over and over again. The thing is that when we study the Old Testament, and we read these stories, and we hear about these people who have lived these lives, and it's so many hundred years ago, thousands of years ago, and we think, wow, that was so long ago. But we can truly see visions of America in here. We can see pictures of the world that we live in as we look at Babylon, as we look at the type of leadership, and when, so many people in our world, everything is controlled by power and by money and the desire for power, and that's what you see here, the desire for fame, all those things. It's very much clear in these pages, and we can look at that. And I think, though, the biggest message here, again, is not only just the sovereignty of God, but just to basically the encouragement of how to live in Babylon, how to not allow Babylon to make us change, make us something different. Babylon did not make Daniel become a bad person just because he was there. He was around a lot of bad influences. He chose not to follow that. And because he trusted in the sovereignty of God, he was able to rest in the place that God had placed him, and he could have confidence in that. So I think for me, that is just a over and over the reminder of just a daily living decision to say, you know what, Lord, where I am right now is where you've got me. And so I want to live to the best of my ability to honor you here. You are the Most High God, and I want my life to honor that. And I want to draw people to you, because Daniel did. He drew people to him. And we don't know how many Babylonians came to faith. We do think Nebuchadnezzar did, because we get his story, but I bet you there are many more, because he lived that kind of life. So let's just wrap it up here with that. And next week we'll jump into chapter 6 of Daniel, which is going to be really good. We're going to focus on some other things, and we'll talk about those. So